So, hello and welcome to the History Ledger, the Economic
Hi.
Society's podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Wallace of the London School of Economics. I'm joined today by Tirthankar Roy, also of the LSE, and we're going to talk about the economic history of empire. So, this episode, it's really about trade between Britain and India in the long 19th century. But we're also going to start with a little discussion about some of the kind of foundational ideas when we start to think about empire, colonialism, and economic history. Some of the groundwork that Tirthankar, your work, has really helped to kind of uncover and set the foundations for. But before we get there, welcome to Tirthankar. Maybe give us a sense of how it is you came to work on the economic history of India. Oh, sorry, India. Maybe
Sure.
give us a sense, Tirthankar, of how you came to work on the economic history of empire in the first place.
Of course. I started as a historian of India, economic historian of India. My first major piece of work was on the history of the artisan industries, crafts in the 19th, 20th century India. And then I moved on to other things. And in 2000, I ended up writing a college textbook called, not surprisingly, The Economic History of India. And that textbook became very successful. It's now the standard taught textbook in most Indian universities and colleges on that subject. Um, so that was a transformation, thinking about more general questions about how, um, especially the British colonial rule, transformed India. But when you do that, you also have to engage with the British Empire itself. What is it, and what is its global influences, legacies, operations? India is only part of that story. It's a big part of that story. But these two subjects, empire and India, especially in the last 250 years, are extremely closely interlinked. You cannot really do one without studying the other. So for me, it was very natural, a kind of organic process to start talking about empire. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do because empire is a much more politically contested subject. And the standard narrative on India that exists, very influential, comes down from the way the Indian nationalists saw the imperial legacy, tells us that it's a massive system for exploitation and extraction of resources, which made Britain rich and India poor. When you do history, you see that narrative doesn't really work. And it doesn't work because it assumes all Indians as victims of the state system, but they were not. I mean, there were people who became extremely rich by trading within the empire. Millions of Indians left India to work in other tropical colonies, and their standard of living was often higher than the places that they came from. Equally, there were many Indians who were trapped in poverty and low wages. So there is an enormous diversity of experience behind this imperial legacy. And I'm trying to uncover that diversity.
That's really great. So, I mean, firstly, you literally wrote the book on this, which means you're the right person to ask these questions to. But I think that's really interesting. And we're going to get into some of the things you've just said a bit later on. But I guess one of your starting points that I think you want us to think about is to move away from really traditional images of empire as necessarily generating one kind of outcome for all Indians, and to appreciate some of the complexities that are inherent in the historical period that we're discussing. That's really great. I mean, we're talking about the long 19th century. It's the British Empire at its high point, as you say, India right at the center of this. But let's get the sense of this kind of nature of empire in this period that we're talking about, because India is not always within what people like I might think of as the formal empire, as I understand it. It's not directly governed from London, at least at the start of the period in the 1780s, 1790s. Maybe can you briefly set the scene for us? How does India fit into empire as it stands in the late 18th century?
Late 18th century will be taking us to a time when the full imperial state hasn't yet emerged. But in the 19th century, it has. And what you then observe is you are absolutely right. And It's a great question to ask because within the British Empire, you actually do see a wide variety of governance systems. And the particular case of India is that Britain, with a separate ministry, Secretary of State for India, is in charge of primarily three things: defense, currency management, and tariffs, free trade. But in every other way, the London office is involved in governing India indirectly by appointing people to rule India. But how they do it is often left to them. And in that process, there is a quite a significant participation of Indians. It grows. Initially, it's limited, but then it grows in running India, and especially in the provincial governments, which are sometimes some of these are as big as the largest European countries, so they're huge. Um, so that's the way London governs India, which is a very limited task-specific governance. It's keen on maintaining trade. It's keen on maintaining geopolitical supremacy. So British armies is effectively the Indian army, and once these are taken care of, it's really not very interested about how India is governed. Um, the other dimension here is the princely states. There are 550 of them, which are nominally independent.
550.
Yes, I mean that's a huge world, and we still, unfortunately, don't know enough about how they were governed and what their priorities were. But as far as British India is concerned, there was a general agreement that these states will not be directly governed by British India, but they will keep their trade routes free, open, and they won't pose a threat, a military threat. And once these two conditions are met, there was an institutional structure by which these conditions were met. But once these were met, the princely states were left alone. So that's how India was made. The governance of India was made.
So this is quite a thin state then, in the sense of kind of the imperial control from London's quite limited. It doesn't extend to from what you're saying, at least to the internal activities of a lot of Indian states, these princely states particularly. But even those people who are sent out from London to govern areas, they're doing so often with lots and lots of Indians employed in the governance, and presumably with quite limited, from what you say at least, quite limited agency. They're not doing that much beyond maintaining, I guess, defense and some measure of public order. Is that right?
That is largely right, yes. Um, I mean, this is a state which, if you take away the military side of things, it really has very little capacity to do any big changes. Its tax take is very small. The revenue to GDP ratio is about 5%, way smaller than Britain at this time. I mean, I'm talking about the 1920s. So, it is a state with limited capacity. And one way that it meets that limited capacity is by relying on older structures of governance within this region, inherited from the Mughal Empire, for example. But it's also different in a way. It's a legislating state. It loves making laws, and it makes lots of them, whether that's property rights or in contracts, in company, especially in commercial law. That is company, contract, and negotiable instruments. The impact of the state is massive. So that's something to be taken care of, to be taken into consideration.
Okay, so if we think about then some potential positive benefits of this, we might think about the expansion of the rule of law, the kind of variety of different, what you might think of as almost legal technologies, these different kinds of contract, these different kinds of tribunals then. That's really
You're
interesting.
right. Yes, I think in terms of commercial law, yes, that's the case. I mean, there is. It's not as if there was no commerce before, but laws were often not coded or informal, and there was a big change there. The joint stock limited liability concept is a new change. In terms of property, it's a little more complex because this state really relies wherever it can on indigenous practices and start making these laws, building laws on practices.
Okay, so there's a difference here. If we're thinking
Yeah.
about the trade kind of mercantile style exchange, then the Indian imperial state creates or imports a variety of ideas of corporations, so laws that allow you to have firms and different ways to build contracts between people that make trade easier. But they don't so
Exactly.
much change the property. That's really. Let me take you back though. Let's go back right to the
Hmm.
kind of the 1780s, 1790s. At this point, we've still got the East India Company very much involved in this. So maybe could you explain how governance works in that sense? How much is in the hands of the East India Company? How much has been handed over to what we might think of as the British state in London at this point?
That's a fascinating question, and I don't think it's been fully answered. But a rough answer
Do your
will
best.
go
Do
like
your
that.
best.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, when it started in 1600, the East India Company was a trading entity. Of course, it's a trading entity supported by power because the crown gives it a monopoly charter. But that really applies to its rivals from Britain, not to Indians. When it came to India, it came actually quite late. I mean, initially its interest was in Indonesian spices, but by the mid 17th century, not just English East India Company, but also their rivals, the Dutch, realized that a good way of conducting Indonesian trade would be by buying cotton textiles from India, which has a huge supply, and taking it to Southeast Asia. So they became interested in textiles and then found that some of these textiles, the more higher quality, the more designed, colored ones, dyes were a big part of the comparative advantage of that industry, sold very well in Europe. And then another kind of trade took off from there. So by the time the East India Company started acquiring state power, which is roughly 1750 to 1765. At that point, it was still a trading entity. Its primary interest was in textiles. But of course, all Europeans were afraid of other Europeans, and they needed to maintain a minimum military capacity, naval capacity to counter the French. And that was really big, quite a hot thing in India at the time, the Anglo-French rivalry. So they had a sort of very basic kind of military setup in India. Not very effective against most Indian armies of the time, but sometimes quite handy as allies in regional conflicts. Now, the big thing that was happening in the 18th century was regional conflicts as the Mughal Empire collapsed. And there were more conflicts and more opportunities for these two actors, especially the British and the French East India companies, to join rival groups as allies. So alliances, it was not conquest, but alliances, they had no power to conquest, to conquer anything, but they were handy allies. And in the process of doing that, doing these proxy battles, Anglo-French battles, the British East India Company developed its military power quite effectively, creating a standing army. It took time, but the time that you are talking about, let's say 1780s, it did have quite an effective army, primarily with Indian infantry soldiers, but they were all on salaries and pensions, which is a new idea in this world. Most of these people for working for the Indian states were part-time peasants. They didn't. They were active militarily only in certain seasons, and they didn't get any pensions. They had a land. Maybe their land rights were protected. So that's they changed that model. They had a yeah.
You've got a kind of increasingly professional army emerging. I guess it's an idea that's imported from Europe. The idea of a fixed wage for a soldier,
Yes.
entitlements, benefits. But it's a really interesting. So this is almost an accidental process that emerges out of the conflict between the English and the French. That's a
Mm,
conflict that had been going on for centuries. And so the emergence of the East India Company power in India at this stage then is it's kind of accidental, it's unintentional. What's the kind of view coming out of I guess in London somewhere there's a big room with a board of
mm,
directors who are sitting there trying
yeah.
to direct policy. Are they behind this?
That's a great question. Well, uh, I mean, a lot of the decisions to join a battle or fight a proxy war is happening at the India end. London directors know about this. I mean, given the nature of communication systems, maybe months later, and things are already quite advanced in India. London directors overall don't like this because this is not trade. Fighting, doing politics is a drain on money, and they were very aware of that. However, something changed in 1757 when the British East India Company acquired the territorial rights, the fiscal rights of a huge state in eastern India, Bengal. And once it did that, and over the next 8 years, it consolidated its presence in Bengal, effectively turning into a government. Once it did that, then the London directors were kind of not so negative because Bengal revenues could now enter into trading investments. And now that almost immediately became extremely controversial because here is a private firm ruling a territory 5,000 miles away in the name of the British Crown. And the British Crown did not know what was going on, and it was creating a bad rule in the name of the Crown. The Parliament didn't like the Crown anyway, and the Parliament didn't like the East India Company, and there were lobbies working there for private traders. So it was that move became very controversial, and London directors were really fighting much of the 1770s when the company was needed loans and was not doing very well as a trading entity. So there was a period of crisis, and that kind of settles down in between 1772 and 1784, when two parliamentary acts make the parliament a party to the governance of Indian territories. So the company from that point onward is a junior partner. The parliament is ruling in the name of the East India Company, but the East India Company directors really don't have much say in who will represent this body in India.
Okay, so we've got this very strange, very accidental accumulation of power driven by local agents in India who are doing things that people in London didn't necessarily want to happen. And that basically builds an empire in India by chance.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the only thing I'll add to that word accidental is that much of this is happening in the backdrop of a political decentralization collapse in India. So if you take away that backdrop, then maybe many of these things wouldn't happen. So that creates an opportunity for many external people who are operating really on the maritime frontier, on the coastlands, to engage with the inland, which is a very different world.
Okay, so in some ways, rather than looking for the causes of this in England or even in France, we should think about this as being driven by internal dynamics in the Mughal state.
Absolutely. And that is something that is a message that comes from largely the Cambridge School historians like Chris Bailey, David Washbrook, and others. And it's been somewhat forgotten now, but my work in some way builds on those premises.
Okay, well, this is fabulous. So we've got this. It's really interesting to kind of talk about the way in which this expansion of power, expansion of British power over India evolves in this way. I mean, it does raise a kind of like basic definitional question, and it's maybe worth just fixing this in
Of
our
course.
minds. Like,
Yeah.
what do we actually mean when we talk about empire? I mean, because what we're talking about here, it seems to challenge so many of the kind of ideas that you might have about strength of control or so on. So give us a starting point. What would you say?
A minimum definition of an empire is one territory controlling another territory, which is different in many ways, maybe geographically distant, maybe culturally different, a different set of rulers. Um, that's the minimum definition. Of course, in that minimum definition, empires had existed throughout recorded history, even within India. Much of the Indo-Gangetic Basin had been ruled by big state systems. Um, what we call empire or colonialism, particularly in the more modern times, let's say the last 200, 300 years of human history, is um, a particular form of empire, and a form which is driven very much by European expansion through settlements, through trade, through migration, and more recent times, cross-border investments. Um, Now, the kind of state that comes up in that context is very keen on protecting these flows, usually between the colony and the colonist power, but not necessarily. So that requires a different set of governance strategies, different kinds of policies, and different mindset, and sometimes very pro-capitalist, pro-business mindset in the more modern times. It also creates a different motivation for imperial expansion. That's the more modern system. So it's a package within the broader empire definition of one territory controlling another, but a package which is very very much driven by capitalism and business interests.
Okay, so this is really interesting. And one of the things that I take from that first definition is that the depth of control can be quite light. And this is something that we just saw in terms of your discussion of how much power London might have had in India, that it could be quite limited because of a whole variety of things. So empire in that sense doesn't necessarily imply a great deal of ability to change things in the country that is subject to the control of another, in part because the state is so weak. Is that fair?
That's broadly fair, yes. Except that in the 20th century, when there is anti-empire movements emerging everywhere, and there's also something that you might call a developmental impulse uh, growing especially in the former colonies of Asia and Africa. Things change. The empire tries to reinvent itself as an agent of development. Often, the first obstacle that comes is that it doesn't have money. But most imperial states didn't were quite poor actually, so to do much development. But its mindset is changing, and some of the things that it does at that time, especially 20th century, in India it starts a little earlier. Um, and some of the things it does then feeds into the development policies that comes after empire's end. So there is a continuity there, and you see that especially in agricultural policy, agricultural infrastructure policy, like canals, railways. You see that hydroelectricity much later. These are things which have a colonial beginning, but the independent states kind of take over. But they are really expressions of this new impulse that, well, we are in charge of developing these regions, not just making business happen.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So we should be really careful about separating our images of empire from maybe the kind of interwar period, the immediate post-war period, from those that might be occurring in the early 19th century, particularly.
Yes.
But this developmental impulse that you talk about, you mentioned railways, you mentioned canals. I mean, those are things that do emerge, are starting to be built out in India in the mid 19th century. So is that the first signs then of a developmental impulse in India, or are they not really part of a kind of state-led imperial package of development?
Well, the word development wouldn't exist in, let's say, 1850s when railways start to happen in India. But if you asked an imperialist governor, what do you think you are doing in India? They will say that we are making progress happen. And the definition of progress is that if Indian economy does a lot of trade with British economy, which is the big emerging power in the world, it will gain. And that's what we are doing here. We are making those transactions happen. So that was the definition of progress, not quite the state stepping in and building things. That idea is much more recent. Now, in terms of railways, much of the railways in India in the initial period was not actually state built. It was state guaranteed, but it was private enterprise. So the state made it happen. It made it happen through a budgetary guarantee that your minimum profits will be guaranteed by us, 5% profits on capital. But the state actually didn't step in to make investments. Canals were different because canals were not really a private good. You couldn't really easily make money out of them. But the canals are a very interesting subject because it happens across Asia and Africa, much of it which is dry tropics. And everybody, I mean, not just the British, but every regime understood that when the seasonal rain comes, if you can trap them, if you can recycle that water, you can make development, you can make agriculture happen in drier territories. So that's part of the folklore of these regions. And what the British did was bring civil engineers into it, but they could do it only under certain conditions. So it didn't happen everywhere. It happened in the Punjab plains in northern India because there were massive Himalayan rivers. I mean, there was a massive water flows which didn't actually spread very much, so the canal spread them. And that transformed an enormous region into a breadbasket, primarily dry grasslands into a breadbasket. You can find examples of that in Egypt, in Sudan, in West Africa, around with the French around Lake Chad. So it's not as if that idea is an European one. It's a very tropical one, which was implemented on a larger scale.
Okay. So we've got this kind of sense then of maybe some things that anticipate later development policies, or at least some
Yeah.
interventions that do. I mean, I think it's really interesting. Surely, I mean, if the state is providing at least some kind of guarantees, some legal framework for the railway, you would have to say there's at least a role for empire in
Of
that.
course, yes. I mean, the state is engaged. I mean, state is involved in railways. It has to acquire the land for railways. That needs the state. It has to acquire land for plantations, give contracts. So the state is involved, but it's involved in a task specific way, not as an ideology that the state should be involved in everything.
Okay. And well, we'll talk maybe more about canals another time because I think it's a subject worth a discussion all on its own, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But one of the things that you've been emphasizing is that the thing that the state, the imperial state, is really interested in is ensuring that there's trade between Britain and India, that there are flows, that it's asking these princely states to allow free market access. It's seeking very much to encourage flows of goods in and out of India. And as you said, the East India Company, it's founded for trade,
Mm.
admittedly, not initially with India, but fairly soon it becomes starts to engage with Indian trade. So maybe you can kind of give us a sense of what actually is going to and from India in the 1780s. What actually makes up the flow of trade? I mean, what is it that they're buying and selling and shipping?
Well, the as I said, I mean, textile trade started from around the mid 17th century, and it's very big, very much centered from Bengal region around 1780s, which is why the East India Company had a sort of political interest in that region. So it kind of concentrates in that area. So textiles, cotton textiles is still very, very big in 1780s. But within, say, 20, 25 years, it starts to decline because Britain manufactured textiles is expanding in Britain. It doesn't import a lot of Indian textiles. It starts exporting first yarn and then cloth. And by 1830s and 40s, that industry is in crisis in India. So there is not much of exports going on, except a few commodities which were very highly designed and had very specific markets, especially West Africa. But um, but then you have a huge change that has happened in between, which is that uh, a form of power which is primarily based in the coasts have started taking over inland. And of course, as a trading firm, East India Company is very interested in seeing what else I can trade. And they find that commodities coming from land are a good deal, except that they require a different trading system. They require much more maybe transport, bulk transport, and certainly much more collaboration with Indians who are growing these goods. The really emerging goods around the late 18th century would be opium, indigo, cotton. And these become very big in the first half of the 19th century. Once railway starts, then you have other goods join this flow because of this bulk transport is now available. So you have wheat, rice, seeds, oil seeds, all sorts of things go into it, and cotton kind of booms. Because the British Industrial Revolution had taken off, and that's all about cotton and metals. So India is in the late 19th century, it's primarily selling land-based goods and buying a lot of textiles and metals from Britain. Metals coming in both as material that go into structural work, but also as earlier guns and cannons, but more as machines in a later period.
Okay, that's an amazing overview. Let's let's go maybe break that down a little bit because I think it's really, really interesting. So the late 18th century, we have this flow of textiles. Now these are mainly cotton. Um, you mentioned they're largely coming from Bengal. Can you give us a sense of kind of what types of fabrics these are? Why are they so successful?
Bengal was successful primarily because of very fine white cotton, which grew there. I mean, muslins. Muslins were an extremely fine cloth. The cotton that muslin comes from is not necessarily very fine, but it could produce very thin yarn, and it it created a type of textiles which were often used for decorative purposes. I mean, you cannot just wear a muslin. I mean, it doesn't work. But you can wear a muslin above other garments, and it looks very nice.
Oh, so
So
these are very thin, are they? Very
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 thin, yes.
fragile.
That's right. I mean, that's very much a Bengali product, but Bengal was primarily a hub for a lot of different kind of textiles which were growing in on a huge region, maybe 100,000 square mile area. Bengal became the hub because the major ports were in Bengal. Calcutta was emerging as a big port. There were also interior ports, and the fact that the Ganges River, I mean, Bengal is a delta of the Ganges River. The Ganges River is navigable for a considerable length upstream, which means that you can access a lot of small town trading marts through the river. I mean, that condition doesn't exist in most parts of India. It exists here. So much of the cloths that was coming in were not just Bengal cloths, but Bengal was the trading hub.
Okay, so this is really interesting. So when we think about Bombay is the main port at the end, is that right? Or is
Bombay
it?
really emerges after the railways. It had
Okay.
been doing a lot of trade, and it also took away a lot of trade from a old Western Indian port called Surat, which is where the East India Company first landed. Everybody
So,
first landed in Surat. Yeah,
so is it Surat that is the hub in the late 18th century?
Surat is hub in the mid 18th century, but Bombay is taking away some of that trade. But that's primarily West Asia trade, Arabian Sea trade. So
But
it
and
access if you want to access Africa, for example, then Bombay is good. But
okay.
if you want to access Europe, then Calcutta was good for a long time.
Okay, so so what we're talking about here with these high quality textiles, that's through Calcutta.
Yes.
Brilliant. All right, so I have this vision now in my mind, and maybe this is wrong, of a really complicated trade connection where lots of different regions of India are supplying quite varied types of cotton goods. Some of these really high quality muslins, some other kinds of textiles, all cotton, I guess. And that's
Yeah.
coming to Calcutta and then being shipped out by the East India Company in really large quantities.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the only qualifications I'll add here are two or three minor factual things. One is that Madras is another huge port in southern region. Madras, again, like Calcutta, it accesses quite a wide region from which textiles are coming in, and a lot of the colored textiles, like the ones you see in the V&A on display in the Indian section, are actually coming from the Madras region because they produce very high quality dyes and a very wide range of them. So some of the most striking colored goods are actually coming from South India. They're coming from Madras. Bombay was never very big in textile trade, but the other qualification I'll add here is that it's not just the company which is doing this trade. The company always had massive, sustained rivalry with private traders. Huge number of British traders thought that they will beat the company. And it's a coastline 4,000 miles long, so it's no good chasing people. The crown monopoly is just a piece of paper. So that has been going on for a very long time. So a lot of this trade is actually conducted by private individuals whom the company tries to chase and punish, who are breaking their monopoly, but by and large, they fail to do that.
Okay, so this is actually, although we tend to think about the East India Company, I clearly do. We shouldn't be thinking about this as too regulated a trade. But even by the late 18th century, it's largely it's a substantial free market portion.
It is. I mean, the monopoly does work in some way. I mean, the company does catch a few people and make examples of them. But if they're really big rivals, then they often very quickly has a compromise. And there are many very interesting examples of this. I mean, one of the biggest rival became a son-in-law of a company director, and then the rivalry ended. So, I mean, you have many funny examples like that. But overall, if you take 100-year history, what you observe is that many of the branch officers of the company were in secret deals with private traders. So it's been a leaking institution for a very long time, and it maybe right from start.
Okay, that's really interesting. So we've got this kind of rich very profitable trade in fabric. And then, what, 40, 50 years ago later, it's essentially disappeared by the sound of it. The export trade in Indian textiles has been utterly displaced by the products of the Industrial Revolution. Is that right? And when would that happen? When would you say this really has occurred by?
I think the first big consignments of cotton yarn starts to come from 1810, 1820, around that time. And then it grows very significantly, it grows. But by the first big consignments of cloth come maybe a little later, because cloth requires a different kind of trade. You have to find consumers. Yarn requires finding producers, and they're more visible than the consumers, and you don't know their tastes. So cloth takes off a little later, but by 1880, um, uh, roughly, I think 50% of the cloth market is controlled. Well, it's supplied by British textiles, and possibly 90% of the yarn market is supplied by textiles. Now, the interesting question is what happens to the other 50? And that is domestic textiles. And why does domestic textiles survive if you have a machine that is 6 times faster available to supply you a cloth? That is a huge question, and much of my early work was trying to answer that question. And what I observe is a very significant extent of survival and revival of artisanal textile production. The only way you can explain that is by looking at consumer markets. That consumer markets could take in British textiles up to a point. The British cloth wasn't able to supply all different varieties of market segments.
Okay, so Indian consumers still want certain types of product, printed
Absolutely,
materials, fine
yes.
materials that you simply can't get it from Lancashire, I guess is the key point.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see, from a simple example, you can see that. I mean, if you look at men's and women's wear, men would prefer, let's say, very standard white or black office wear. That kind of stuff came from Manchester in a big way. Women wear saris. Every sari is different from another sari. Manchester was no good there. So you needed another kind of production system.
Okay, so these kind of finely decorated, these highly crafted textiles that had been actually the center of Indian exports as well, still had this
Yeah,
very distinctive market in India.
indeed.
So that's really interesting. So if we think about the way that industrialization, the emergence of the Industrial Revolution in the north of England and the massive improvements in productivity in spinning thread and in weaving that into cloth, they basically destroy the English import market for Indian textiles, but they only replace about half of the Indian import market for Indian demand for textiles, even at the end of this period.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we talked about the artisanal textiles, which survive thanks to specific differentiated consumption markets. But the other story here is the cotton merchants of Bombay and Gujarat who are supplying Manchester loads of cotton. And they realize the Manchester machine makers, the Platt brothers and others, tell them, why you do this? I mean, you start a mill in Bombay and we'll come and operate it. Why sell cotton here? You're losing on profits. And they listen to them. They start making cotton textile mills in Bombay and Ahmedabad, and they're doing very well.
Okay, and when do those mills first get set up?
The first mill set up in the starts in the 1850s. I think 1854 is the exact date when the first functioning mill set up. But it's very hard then to get machines over and set them up, install them, get people to run them. That process really takes quite a long time to take off, but it's in the 1860s during the American Civil War when there is a cotton famine worldwide and everybody turns to India, especially Britain. I mean, Britain had been buying from India, but on a much more limited scale and then trying to blend that cotton with other types of cotton. But that takes off in the 1860s. And at that point, there is a much closer connection between machine making, textile machine making industry in Britain and the Indian cotton merchants. And the real takeoff of this industry starts from that point onward.
So let me understand something here. So you mentioned there that they're not really the English manufacturers of cotton thread are not using so much cotton from India until the 1850s, 1860s. Is that because the type of cotton is difficult to use? Is there a reason for this?
That's exactly right. Yes. I mean, Indian staples are different, the average Indian staples. Um,
Sorry, okay, you're going to have to explain what is a
yeah.
staple.
I mean, it's the fiber length. And depending on the fiber length, you get different qualities of cloth. American cotton, by and large, is longer staple. Egyptian cotton is long staple. Indian cotton is short staple, and that creates a problem for what kind of cloth you want. Now, you can solve that in the blow room of a mill where different types of fibers can be mixed up. But that technology, and especially the ideal type of blending, is a different skill, and that skill develops over time. But once that develops, then you can use practically cotton from anywhere to
Okay.
and manage to produce cloth of a wide scale of variety.
So British manufacturers basically don't have the right technology to use the type of cotton, these short fiber cottons that are grown in
Mm.
India, until they're forced to by the American Civil War closing off the production from the United States. That's the kind of story we've got.
That's the story. I mean, there's a interesting prehistory to that story, which is that the East India Company and especially the company in the 1840s tried very hard to build American-style plantations in India, which with American cotton plants, and they failed. They failed very badly. I mean, they invited Americans, come and set up, and realized that those plants don't grow in India, and the Americans don't want to live in these very dry lands where the cotton cultivation takes place, and it's much better to fall back on the Indian varieties. So it's really an environmental story in some way that you cannot really grow different kinds of cotton plant in different environments.
Okay. So then we've got this emerging export market for cotton, and you also mentioned other commodities, things like opium, indigo, and these are an increasing share of Indian exports. Um,
That's right. Yes.
where are they going?
Well, opium goes to China primarily. Opium has been traded within India for a very long time. It's used as a prophylactic, well, sometimes as an addictive substance, but it had a variety of uses as a painkiller. But China is primarily addiction substance. I mean, that's the market it's going to. Probably there are other uses as well. But I mean, the Chinese, I mean, there are big trading ports on the Chinese coastline, which are controlled by the East India Company, and but these are trading ports. I mean, they don't access the inland, so you have another set of merchants who are really mediating between the inland consumption and these trading ports which are bringing the Indian opium. So that's quite a big trade. It really takes off after opium wars in the 1830s. I mean, before that, it starts long before that, which is why those wars are called opium wars. But after that, the trade grows in volume quite significantly. And as the trade grows in volume, the East India Company or the British government is not producing the opium, but they collect a very significant amount of tax from it or share in the profits of the growth, profits of the cultivation. There's another. I mean, this happens within British India in Eastern India, which has very good opium lands. They still grow opium, by the way. And then there is a part in central India which was part of a princely state, which grew very high quality opium, in fact, better quality. And the government allowed that trade to happen. Those opium came to Bombay and collected a tax from it.
Okay.
So this income was very significant part of the revenue in the late 19th century. So the British government was, despite many resistance and criticism that this is not a good trade, and of course Chinese government was very angry. It couldn't really stop this.
Okay, because it had become dependent on opium itself.
Indeed.
All right, that's really interesting. So there are kind of two wars here that really matter if we're thinking about this. One, the American Civil War that changes the demand for Indian cotton, and the other, the opium wars with China, which open up this market for Indian opium. And these two things together are really important then in shifting the pattern of Indian trade by the sound of it.
Yes, you can say that. Yes,
And
that's
that's
right.
so, I mean, one of the things that we think about in terms of having an imperial relationship, and you mentioned we've talked about trade, is the way in which the empire might limit or can put constraints on trade. Do these matter in this setting? Are there kind of legal limits, the Navigation Act, some other kind of laws that might be containing the direction of trade, who you can trade with, how you trade, that type of thing?
Not directly, no. I mean, the Navigation Acts really come to an end by the late 18th century. What happens in the 19th century is a much freer trading field, and the British Empire really doesn't do anything legal in controlling it. I mean, what it does is, um, I mean, well, there are two or three ways that a state can control trading systems. I mean, one is, of course, tariffs. The other is law, and the third is maybe currency manipulation. Now, there's not much currency manipulation going on in this time. There is not even a central bank. Tariffs are near zero when you trade within the empire, but that's not an uneven field because that applies to Britain itself. Britain cannot impose tariffs either. Um, and in terms of laws, as I said, the imperial state was more pro than played a negative role. So the empire didn't actually directly interfere with its state power. What happened, however, is that throughout the 19th century, the businesses that were engaged in trading were very much Britain oriented. So when India trades with Africa, goods will first come to Liverpool or London and then get re-exported. That relationship was more mediated by British control of shipping, especially intercontinental shipping, and the role of London in conducting some of the key trades of the 19th century. Think of tea. Tea grows everywhere. Tea grows in Kenya a little later. Tea grows in Ceylon in India. But that's only the first part of the business. What really decides the tea market is how you blend different teas and how you assess the quality. Now, that depends on a group of people called tasters, which is a very highly refined skill. You don't get it everywhere. Now, those testers, there's a bunch of testers in London, and there are a few in plantation estates as well, but the main hub is London. And they taste, they decide how to blend teas, and so and then these blends get auctioned. So the auction market, because of this concentration of skills, is London based. The whole world's tea comes here first, get processed, and then sent to the whole world. Now, that's a different kind of relationship. It's not mediated by the state, but it is definitely mediated by British capabilities in the 19th century.
That's really interesting. Every time I hear about tea tasters, I think I missed my calling. I
Yeah,
just
indeed.
love that job. Wonderful. So this is really interesting. So the kind of pattern of trade then by the 19th century, goods are flowing from different bits of the empire to Britain, but that's about processing. That's about adding value. In this example, about making tea from raw commodity into a finished product, and then because of that, then flowing out again to other export markets. But this is
Yes,
all within empire. If you
yes.
were a French merchant, would you have equal access to Indian trade in the 19th century? Would it be as easy to sail from Marseille? Or...
The French, of course, had colonies in India. They had Pondicherry, they had Mahe, they had Chandranagar, and they were doing a lot of trade from there. Not, of course, as much as British India. Now, the thing about ethnicity of Europeans coming to India is a little complicated because I mean, there are a lot of Germans who are doing trade. It kind of, the world wars kind of stopped that, but then they revived again quickly in the interwar period. Americans were doing trade. And in the 1920s, an increasing number of Japanese were doing trade. So there were clearly a lot of people interested in British Indian trade, in taking a share of it. And I have not seen any report of these people complaining that British India was an obstacle or the British power was an obstacle. If anything, they thought otherwise, that it's a good deal. I mean, the well-developed ports and harbors and the business law. So I don't think that any trading entity in the 19th century, early 20th century really saw imperialism or the empire as an obstacle. And equally, you see British people operating. I mean, the two main hubs where British traders were very active in India. They were not active everywhere, but the two main regions where they were active was Bengal and Malabar, the modern Kerala state, which is partly a British Indian district called Malabar and partly a princely state called Travancore and Cochin, two princely states. Now, if you observe the difference between Travancore and Malabar, you see no difference. I mean, the British businesses were welcomed in both. Travancore state built very close relationships with these people because they got a lot of taxes out of them. I don't think that ethnicity in trading, at least, really mattered very much. Ethnicity mattered in other ways. I mean, once you have Europeans maybe controlling the jute industry, then they control a lot of information. And a great deal of trading information, trade secrets pass through ethnic channels. But that is true of the Indians as well. Cotton merchants are not going to welcome you into their trade unless you are another cotton merchant already or come from the same family network.
Okay, so there's not really boundaries then around trade. This is a fairly free and open market. There are
It's
flows
fairly
everywhere.
free and open market, yes. I mean, there are business historians who will tell you that in Calcutta, European banks, European traders hobnobbed with, played golf with the governors, and that created a difference. But the evidence for that is anecdotal. I mean, it's very vague.
Okay. So, I mean, we've talked then about a whole range of different ways in which India's embedded in the empire, in which empire and helps shape the economy and the flows of trade between Britain and India. If I want to understand this, if I want to step back and understand this from the perspective of the Indian economy as a whole,
Hmm.
how important would you say exports are to the Indian economy? And this is presumably still, it's largely a rural society, it's largely agricultural. These commodities, even the textile, the finished textiles of the first period, or even these agricultural commodities like opium or raw cotton or indigo towards the end of the 19th century, are they a big part of the Indian economy? Are they fairly small? How should we think about this?
That's a great question, and it's kind of key to understanding the legacy of the empire, the larger legacy. Well, you are absolutely right. I mean, it is a small part. The exports at the height maybe doesn't exceed maybe 10% of GDP. That's way below some of the ratios you see in West Africa, let's say the cocoa exporting colonies. It's not a trading, exporting economy in that sense. I mean, one thing here that we need to bring in, which really distinguishes India from, say, a cocoa exporting colony, is that India is huge and its internal market is massive. So the reason why it doesn't trade enough, I mean, wheat is a very good example. I mean, wheat trade takes off in the late 19th century up to about First World War, and then it starts declining. Now, if you see what is happening there, it's not as if the whole trade declines, but the domestic market takes over. The same people who are selling to Britain before now find that Indians are eating bread. So why not here? Why not sell here? I mean, it's much easier. So the same trading system, same people, same institutions are serving the Indian market. Um, so some of that, I mean, that happens to the textiles as well, to some extent. So partly it's the Indian home market that keeps the export share small. But you are absolutely right. The other thing is this massive agriculture, the massive countryside, which is really very marginally involved in this entire business development. It's producing some of the export goods, but farmers are not selling them. The people who are selling them, the bankers, the traders, the merchants, the insurers, they are making the money. Producers don't. And it's a huge puzzle why that inequality develops. Why is it that the farmers, who even when they join long distance trade, don't gain enough?
Okay. I mean, I think this is something we might want to explore on another occasion, but I think it's
Yeah.
really interesting the story you're telling there that even as farmers in India start to be integrated into these export markets, it's other indigenous business elites who actually reap the profits from this.
Yes.
That's the story I'm hearing. So
That's the story. Yeah.
yeah. So engaging in this growing volume of global trade leads to greater inequality within India.
Yes.
As one
I
of
mean,
its
the state is implicated in this in some way because the state really doesn't recognize this emerging inequality until very late. So in some way, it needs the state, the countryside needs the state in a different way from the business sectors. And that different way takes very long time to develop. It really doesn't develop until the 1960s and 70s in India.
Wait, sorry, what is that different way? Just
The kind of steps that the state took to generate a green revolution.
ah,
So that means investing in irrigation. That means subsidizing inputs. That means subsidizing electricity. Maybe giving a commitment to buy some of these goods. All that and a massive, massive drain on the budget has been going on in India for about 40, 50 years. You need the state as a partner of the peasants in this kind of agricultural systems. There was no chance that the British Empire could commit to that kind of deal.
okay. So there's a really interesting contrast there between the kind of developmental state that emerges in India in the 1960s,
Yes,
which is willing to devote enormous resources to improving agriculture, and
indeed.
that much thinner imperial state of the 19th century that
Mm.
does some things, supports
Yeah.
railways, builds some canals, but largely leaves the internal economy of India alone,
Yes.
and leaves it up to Indian businessmen and often Indian
Mm.
administrators to help shape the structures that start to generate these products that are exported over time through India's ports.
Yes.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, I think we've covered an enormous amount. I think we should. I mean, I think there are lots of other conversations to have here. Um,
Of course.
but let me first say thank you. This has been incredibly insightful. We've got a really good sense here of how thin, in some ways, the British Empire is, and also how over the long 19th century, patterns of trade really shifted, where India goes from being the hub of exporting high quality products to being largely a country or the region, really a collection of countries, a part of the empire that is exporting a whole variety of largely agricultural products to often different markets. Um,
Yes.
we've seen how industrialization plays a really important part in shifting that early pattern of trade, but also then I think it's really interesting, kind of the military expansion of empire in the Opium Wars, but also the internal developments of the United States play a big part in this as well.
Yes. Yes.
So wonderful. I mean, I think we have a really, really interesting story. There are so many more conversations to be had. I want to hear about those canals, but thank you to Tirthankar for your time. I think we have a much better understanding of India in the 19th century and its relationship to the economic history of the British Empire as well.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Brilliant. Well, we'll talk again soon. Thank you so
Sure.
much.